Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Saul, and thank you again for having me. It's always a real pleasure to join my fellow Apodians. And it's a very nice meeting you, Amir, and thank you for the insightful presentation. So let me not really delay any further. Our panel will be about discussing basically the journey of the APORDE alumni group, starting from where they started and where they are now currently, and with the intention of understanding what sort of effect APORDE has had on their careers and what could be suggested for future APORDians. So let me introduce my fellow panelists. The first one is Mwanda Piri. Mwanda is an accomplished researcher and an economist. She, as a highlight, she's quite a published author and published a chapter in Zambia's industrial policy in the first Oxford Handbook. And she's also an APORDE alumni. The second is Eze Asuzu, who is a Principal Assistant General Secretary of the Nigerian Labour Congress, and who, amongst some of his highlights, was a delegate to the 2023 AGOA Africa Regional Conference in South Africa, where he participated in consecutive African sovereign debt conferences. And the next one is someone who I personally know in Kabanga Moyo, a former APORDE alumni, who's currently the sector analyst at the Trade and Sector Development Program of the Northern Cape Department. And last but not least, my very good friend, Nikki Cataneo, who I'm sure all of you have had the pleasure of meeting as the course director, along with Saul, of APORDE, and a very good friend of mine for a very long time. I would like to suggest that we go about it in a bit of a different way on this panel question of also keep sticking to time. I will be asking questions directed at all of you, and I will tell you exactly who I'm asking the question to, but you will pretty much all get a chance to answer the question. And so if you could all be alert.
Let me start by just saying thank you to APORDE for giving me the opportunity to share the work we're doing, which I think sits in very well in the overall conversation about industrial development in Africa. And I say this because we see charter cities as being really this big push idea that can help us improve governance, drive economic transformation, and ultimately improve livelihoods. Okay, so just to jump in terms of why we focus on charter cities, the motivation for the work that we're doing, what we see as key development events or phenomena that's happening across the continent. For Africa, it's really an issue of rapid urbanization. Africa is urbanizing in this century. Most of the world has already urbanized, but this is when we see urbanization taking place. So it's an issue of market and timing. In terms of population numbers that we're very familiar with, currently sitting at 1.2 billion people, but we know by 2050, the UN is estimating that we're likely to grow our population to 2.3 billion. And what is interesting from an urbanization perspective is that nearly 1 billion new urban residents will be added to our existing cities. Now, if we know our existing cities, we know some of the challenges that they face in terms of not expanding infrastructure fast enough to accommodate, the expansion in the urban population, informality, the kind of jobs that are being created. Largely our cities in terms of economies are consumption cities, driven by wholesale and retail trade. So already indications that we're likely to face challenges. But here, just to demonstrate as well that this idea of new cities, which is what we are trying to advance as the Charter Cities Institute, it's not entirely new. As of 2019, interesting to note, about 120 new planned cities had actually started across the continent. So the problem we are trying to address really is what we see as this decoupling between development and urbanization. Even in the context of structured transformation, in the context of industrialization, if you look back historically, industrialization has been tightly linked with urbanization. And urbanization has equally been tightly linked with increase in income. So this is just an excerpt from a study that was done by Decon and others. And what you see is just the correlation between urbanization and per capita, GDP per capita, I beg your pardon. And the yellow line for Africa here, sub-Saharan Africa, you can see it's relatively flatter, which just indicates that in terms of the relationship between urbanization and per capita income, Africa is not necessarily growing income, at least compared to the rest of the world, the way their income rose as they became more urbanized. We're going towards the 50% mark, where 50% of our population will be in urban areas. But in terms of per capita income, it's not rising at the same sort of commensurate rate that we saw the rest of the world. And so a story of, rapid urbanization, but at much lower income. And historically, we know cities have been engines of economic development. Industrialization itself, was a process where you're moving from rural activities, right, largely in agriculture, to factories that would be in cities. So there's always been this link between development and urbanization, and more particularly between urbanization and industrialization. I'll just skip over this quickly in the interest of time. This was just to demonstrate that at 50% urbanization, the rest of the world, the US, South Korea, already per capita income was quite high. For Africa, we're still around 1,600, and yet we are going towards 50% urbanization. So here again, just another compelling argument to show that we are urbanizing, but without industrialization. If you look at the graph for Africa and the Middle East, no, positive correlation that you can see between, increase in urbanization rates and the share of manufacturing and services in GDP. So this is the typical story of our cities, which is that, informal settlements, congestion, which negatively impacts productivity and hence economic growth. And then huge demand for employment, young people queuing up for jobs. So we are looking at charter cities as a potential solution to the problems that we are facing. And essentially, we see them as being the next generation of special economic zones. And if we're very familiar with special economic zones, we know they are industrial policy tools. So it can be one effective tool that leverages urbanization, but at the same time focuses on industrial development, so that we can use this tool more effectively to foster improved governance and ultimately productivity growth and economic transformation. So charter cities, if you think about the governance literature, new institutions, I would argue it's a balance of both approaches in terms of market enhancing and growth enhancing. And this is, these are some of the discussions we had. I think Professor Mushtaq Khan talked about this under APORDE. So we try to combine both arguments of how do we address those market issues in terms of property rights, in terms of contract enforcement, controlling for corruption, but also, combine it with the state playing a role in terms of using this model as an industrial policy too, to stimulate, more increased investments, which should be both foreign and local, to unleash entrepreneurship, I beg your pardon, to foster, employment creation and ultimately have the sort of impacts that we want to see. So in a nutshell, with charter cities, we're saying bigger border special economic zones, which are designed to be like cities because cities are engines of economic development, with new rules that are trying to address governance issues, large so that they can be more impactful, not enclave, multi-industry. We have an urbanization problem, so we need to plan for affordable housing. But beyond that, for economic activities that can also provide opportunities for a youthful population who are demanding employment, productive employment opportunities. And then devolved authority. This is the key element about charter cities that I think distinguishes it from the typical special economic zone model, which is that we're saying with most special economic zones in Africa, they haven't had the same impact that we've seen in China, for instance, if you think about Shenzhen. And one of the things we learned from there, it's just this, ability to be able to have a more flexible, nimble administrative authority in place. So allowing for rules to change, allowing for the administrator of the zones, right? And in the case of Shenzhen, it was the local authority there. But having that sort of devolved authority to be able to experiment with rules, to change them as and when needed, to respond to, evolving business needs, to be able to address institutional gaps. And so through that policy experimentation, being able to keep what works, scaling that up, and then discarding of what doesn't. So with the charter city model, really, it's this idea of how do we pick lessons from some of the most successful zones, definitely contextualize them for the local context, and apply those to this special economic zone and amplify it so that it can be a bit more impactful in terms of fostering the economic transformation that we have in mind. And how do we leverage private sector capital expertise to be able to plan for our city as well, to be able to plan not just the spatial planning, but the industrial planning as well, and to attract the financing that's needed to invest in the infrastructure that we know is critical for production in terms of, electricity, water, in terms of, roads as well. That is also critical for trade. So the idea, and I apologize, I'm trying to go through this quickly. So we can improve governance. And here, just the last point I'm going to make, and the reason why we think this is a more effective model, right? So there's been a huge, governance agenda pushed by institutions we're very familiar with, World Bank, IMF, you name it, the Bretton Woods institutions. And over the last 2 decades, what we see in terms of governance indicators used by the World Bank for Sub-Saharan Africa, stagnation or decline in terms of these common measures. So we're talking about government effectiveness if we want to zero in on issues of industrialization, regulatory equality as well, very little improvement, if not decline. So there hasn't been a lot of progress in improving good governance. And largely it goes back to the arguments that in order to improve governance, you need, strong institutions. It's an issue of state capacity, subnational capacity. And so how do you address governance given these constraints? And we think with the charter city model, where you're creating a new city from scratch, given special jurisdiction to have good governance rules around business so that we can unleash entrepreneurship, where there's more flexibility for either the local authority to partner with the private sector, or it could be privately led, to be able to change rules and the norms around how you do business in line with what businesses need, and to do it more flexibly, not to wait 1 or 2 years for reform to go through the usual government bureaucracy. And so we think through this model, we stand a higher chance of addressing entrenched interests that tend to hold back reforms, and that we have a better chance of being able to address this problem. So I'll end here in the interest of time. I apologize. Back to you, Christian.
Wanda, much appreciated. You took me back to my days of attending APORDE, and I believe a few of our colleagues, indeed, Mushtaq and one of Mushtaq co-author, Nicolas Mezel, back there will agree with you on your funding on the failings of good governance. Appreciated. Thank you. Apologies, I in my haste to get started, I skipped one of the panel members, and my sincere apologies to Ellen for this. Ellen Davis is the head of the program of the African Climate Foundation, the ACF. She is she has a keen interest in geopolitics, political economy, and gender. And please welcome as well on this panel. I just want to make sure, is any other panelist presenting as well before we dive into the questions on the where we are now?
Yes, this is Eche.
Yes, Eche.
I don't have a PowerPoint. I want to speak to my point, very few points I have. Can I go ahead?
You're more than welcome. Please go ahead, yes.
Sake of our time, I'd want to say thank you to Trade and Industrial Policy Institute South Africa and the South African government for the opportunity of APORDE. I must say that this is a very rare opportunity and something to be encouraged. I was at APORDE last year, and I had the privilege of being tutored by very great minds. I had the opportunity of talking about the economic strategical view, and time to focus on green transition. A lot to learn from that, and of course, Professor Hashud Chan, Professor Mushtaq Khan, Professor Christopher Kramer, and Professor Fazibel and others. Of course, Professor Nikki Catenio. Great opportunity to meet these great persons and to share in their wealth of knowledge. My understanding of my task is to relate how far we have actually translated what we learned as members of the APORDE family in our different work, our different fields of endeavor. I want to say that on getting back to Nigeria, I did a report to my organization, the Nigeria Labour Congress. By the way, that's the largest trade union organization by paid subscription in Africa. And I had the trade and investment and decent work program for the NLC. And I felt that the lessons that were availed during the APORDE program contribute to reshaping the way we engage government and other stakeholders on trade and investment issues. The NLC is a member of the Nigerian social dialogue process. So that means our views are mainstream the national policies. So understanding of some of these issues helps actually changing the nature of public policy in Nigeria to ensure that we have like the Africa that we want. So part of my recommendations were from the views I distilled from my engagement with APORDE is that Africa, by some design, which I believe is deliberate, is meant to be on the lowest rung of things in terms of the replications of historical of colonial models of exploitation of natural, mineral, and manpower resources, and the emphasis on industrialization policy in Africa as a way of keeping Africa at that lower food chain of global production, and thus making the continent largely a consumer continent. I think it's by design, and therefore Africa must approach this deliberately also. And when I heard, I think it was Ahmed that was talking about coordinated approach to some of these issues in African countries, synergy in African countries, I think is important. It's part of our deliberate, should be part of our deliberate response, and to deal with some of these historical, economic deprivation for the continent. And I also pointed out to the Congress and to also our trade network that we have missed out on the three major industrial revolutions, and we're about to miss out on the one. And that should not be do what it takes. Invest more in social services, health, education is important. We cannot actually embrace industrial policy without adequate investment in social infrastructure. We must develop our education system. We must reevaluate our school curriculum to make sure that it is at par with the current demands in the workplace. Also, I made the point that trade and investment policies are very important, and therefore we must be deliberate about it. It must be inclusive, and it must have elements of research work. Currently, we're dealing with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and last week we were in Addis Ababa for the 57 UNECA and the Council of Ministers conference. And the issues of how to make Africa Continental Free Trade Area work for everyone, work for Africa, and deliver the Africa we want by 2063 was top of the agenda. And for us, it was from our presentations as a member of the African Trade Union Network on Economic Transformation that was present, that was part of that conference. We made a point that decent work and labor standards must be fused in the African Continental Free Trade in order to leverage on the productive force, the productive capabilities of the continent in a fair and sustainable manner. What are we saying? That Africa must not be, the colonial model of imposing very abysmal labor standards and taking Africa as as where wage labor is cheap, and therefore using that as an economic leverage. That is something that we must avoid if we must actually build the kind of the Africa we want. So the issues of labor standards, issues of decent work must be part of the African Continental Free enough administration. I think the pathways for Africa is also something that was recommended. We recommended that Africa must especially forward. The NLC has we have been trying to engage. Last week we had a meeting with the leadership employers in the energy and power sector in Nigeria, some kind of social dialogue where we try to exchange ideas and see how we can actually, motivate the kind of policies that will enable us to embrace green growth and ensure that we deploy renewable energy, which is very abundant in the continent. To ensure
my apologies, HA.
I think it's something. Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes,
I can hear you.
We seem to be using now half of the time, and we're getting a message that your bandwidth is low. Can I, my sincere apologies, can I ask you would you like to wrap up?
Yes, I'm actually wrapping up. So what are we saying? At the end of the day, the whole issue boils down on governance, politics. African politics is currently broken. It's not the politics that has delivered, the kind of dividends that the people want. And therefore, we must remake politics in Africa in order to improve governance that can deliver on some of these aspirations that we talk about in APORDE. So politics and governance is important. So we must strengthen the structures, social pillars that actually support sustainable governance, democratic governance, and politics that serves the interests of the people. So it's very important. So in rounding off, I would say that we have taken a number of actions on some of these recommendations that were made as a APORDE experience. We have increased the level of events, including a meeting that took place last December with the Focal Institution on Trade in Nigeria, where we shared ideas on how we can mistreat some of the and some of the lessons we learned from please try to engage on programs that can actually avail lesson sharing, and lesson learning with their different home, so that we can all together work towards having the kind of Africa that we want, an Africa that is emancipated, an Africa that takes a strategic place in geopolitics. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you so much, Eche. And some of the points you have raised took me back also to some of the discussions interesting we had with not only Nikki and Prof. Faisal Ismail, but also the late Andikam Kandowe. Thank you so much, and it was really a pleasure to hear you. May I now proceed to the next panelist, Ellen Davis? Would you like to come forward? Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Christian, and really nice to see you again, and colleagues, and thank you for having me. So I was asked to give a bit of an overview of where I am today, how APORDE's influenced my thinking, and also some of the opportunities or challenges that I see in my work for development on the continent. So to start with, I am head of programs at an organization called African Climate Foundation. We're a relatively young organization. We're only 5 years old. But what we do is we're a climate change grantor. We raise funding from philanthropy and we distribute that to projects on the continent. But importantly, we're an African-based, African-led, majority African-run organization. So we're not interested in cut and paste approaches to climate change from the global north, but really, really interested in understanding how to unlock developmental opportunities from climate change interventions. So work very much at the nexus of climate and development. We have grant making across 32 countries. We have 3 dedicated country programs, and that's building out to 6 over the course of this year. And we work on areas such as renewable energy, electric vehicles, sustainable land use and agriculture, adaptation and resilience, sustainable finance, international partnerships, which is really around Africa's big trade partners. But one of the programs that is very close to my heart and has really been influenced by my experience on APORDE is a program of work that we're building out around critical minerals and green industrialization. And I think importantly, what we realized is that we do a lot of work at the end of the value chain trying to support the scale up of renewable energy and electric vehicles. but we didn't want to inadvertently perpetuate a model where we see extraction of resources on the continent exported elsewhere to manufacture products that are then imported at a premium. So we're really building out a very big program of work, fundraising for it, building a team around green industrialization. I think that when I reflect on some of the important developments and challenges for the continent, I want to make two observations. They might be a bit spicy, but the first is that when I did APORDE a while ago now, and until not so long ago, within the dominant neoliberal discourse, industrial policy was a swear word. It was dismissed, it was sidelined, it was seen as incompatible with mainstream economic thinking. Yet today, even some of the most hardline neoliberals are advocating for industrial policy. And this is a stark shift in global economic thinking. There's, of course, a risk here, the risk of capturing the narrative and using it to maintain the status quo. But I also think it opens up more policy space for the developing world, and this is something that we should capitalize. The second observation is that when I did APORDE a while ago, and until not so long ago, even amongst heterodox economists, climate change was largely treated as an environmental issue. It was seen as important, but not central to economic debates. And where it was acknowledged, it was often as an add-on rather than a fundamentally interconnected consideration with development. But this has also shifted, and there's a far more holistic approach to climate and development amongst progressive economists. And this too is a really important development and something that we should capitalize on as an opportunity in the global south. In our work, what we're seeing is immense demand from African countries for support on green industrialization. There's a clear recognition that countries don't have the luxury of following the same route to development as the early and late industrializers that did so off the back of fossil fuels. And there's now a concerted effort by governments to understand new pathways to development, tailored both to our specific needs on the continent, but also informed by the global realities. And at the same time, we're living through a historic moment of geopolitical flux. We know that the global rule-based system is collapsing, it's creating uncertainty, but it's also opening up the policy space for countries to shape their own development trajectories. For African countries, this presents a really unique, but I think very time-sensitive opportunity. With the right strategies, green industrialization can drive economic transformation, it can create jobs, it can enhance energy security, it can improve people's lives. But the window of opportunity to act is very, very small, and the level of support needed is big. So for me, the period that we find ourselves in, and I think this talks a bit to Amia's point, we're not going to get help from outside, necessitates that each of us in our small spaces of influence should be actively working towards providing that support and pooling our resources into supporting countries and very important regional initiatives like the AFCFTA to help us as a continent to seize the opportunities. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And surely you and I, whenever you're available, should have a discussion on your findings, because it is one of the topical trends right now within the IDC, and some of the approaches we would like to do under certain recommendations from Cabinet. So I will be looking for you and looking forward to our discussions. Thank you so much, Ellen. All right, so we will move to the next speaker, who is my friend and APORDE alumni, who I'm really glad to see after so many years, Kabanga. Please come onto the floor, and it's good to see you after a long time.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks to everyone listening. Yes, my name is Kabanga Moyo. I attended APORDE in 2014. I was in the same class with my fellow APORDEan, Ellen, who just spoke now. Yeah, I'm working at the Department of Economic Development and Tourism. It's a provincial department in Northern Cape Province. I'm currently acting director for a program called TRADE, and sector development. In the program, we have got an understanding that growth and employment are both sector-specific rather than sector-neutral. Something that I learned from APORDE. And because of that, we are prioritizing sectors in which to intervene with different programs that we develop. In that regard, as a department, through the program that I'm heading, we are prioritizing agriculture and agro-processing, metals, machinery and equipment sector. We are prioritizing mining as well as renewable energy, by mere fact that the Northern Cape is sort of a capital of the renewable energy industry in the country, especially solar. We conduct sector studies, in those priority sectors to identify challenges that need to be surmounted and also opportunities that can be explored. Some of the sector studies that we have done in the program, I have presented them at APORDE in the past few years. We did a sector study on renewable energy when we were looking at how to insert, SMMEs into the renewable energy value chain. And we are of the opinion that the renewable value chain in the province is so big, and it involves big companies that are often foreign, that come with their own supply chains to develop projects. And we thought that there are low-hanging fruits, around renewable energy. And one of the low-hanging fruits that we picked up through the sector studies is the small-scale embedded generation, the installation of solar panels on roof of buildings. So we developed a sector study around that, and then we transformed it into a strategy that gave birth to a renewable energy incubator where we are training SMMEs to get competency in installation, maintenance of the rooftop solar systems. That is what we have done in the renewable energy area. In agro-processing, Northern Cape is agro-based industry. And part of the agro-processing industry in Northern Cape is export-oriented. You've got the raisins industry that export a lot of the product to Europe. In that regard, we worked with the raisins industry. It's organized through Raisins South Africa to develop an export promotion strategy, to advance their exports in Europe and the rest of the world. And we did that using a model that we acquired as a department. It's called the Trade Decision Support Model. It's developed in South Africa by a firm called Trade Advisory. So we worked with the resin industry to develop an export promotion strategy for their product. And that went very well, and we are opening up new markets through that initiative. And then I mentioned the metals, machinery, and equipment sector. This is a sector that we identified recently as a department to support for job creation and also for employment. This is a sector that is linked to the mining industry. Northern Cape is very big in mining. You've got, a quite big mining sector based on iron ore, manganese, and you've got zinc now that has come in, copper. So the metals, machinery, and equipment industry has got a strong link with mining, which means that with the growth of mining, there are linkages that can be exploited, with this MME sector. So we commissioned the University of Johannesburg, the Center for Competition, Economic Development, and it's CRED. I think it's a Center for Competition, Economic Development. I can't remember the full acronym. Yeah, so they are developing the strategy for us. And, being part of APORDE, it assisted a lot in us coming up with the terms of reference to appoint a service provider in this regard, because we're quite clear that we want a service provider that is glued in heterodox approaches in economics, people that can actually be agile in terms of applying different approaches to economics rather than be stuck into a singly mainstream approach. So that's how we managed to get CRED on board, because CRED, as you would know, they are quite diverse in their appreciation of economic analysis approaches. So yeah, that's what we are working on. So the study is going to be concluded at the end of this financial year, which ends at the end of this month. And then implementation will start in the coming financial year, that starts in April. And alongside that, alongside developing the strategy, we also were engaging with the companies that are in this sector, to try to create, a strong dialogue between government and the private sector. Something that I also learned through APORDE, the importance of taking the private sector or the firms along as you develop strategies to assist them grow. So APORDE has been quite helpful in terms of how I approach my work. But one suggestion that I would like to make to APORDE is to try and reach out to head of departments of economic development at a provincial level, alongside their executive managers that are responsible for trade and sector development, because that's where industrial policy sit. Maybe one session in a year, then it's not a lot of departments, it's only 9 of them. Invite the head of department, the HOD, and the executive manager responsible for trade investment, so that they can also get to understand, the diverse approaches that can be applied to develop an economy, and also the approaches that have worked historically. Because what I often found at times, the approaches that we learn from APORDE, they are sort of anti-mainstream. They are not consistent with what people know when it comes to economics and economic development theory. So there is some resistance. You need to do a lot of explaining. But if those executives can be taken through, the diverse approaches through a program like APORDE, that will help a lot. And then the other thing that I'll mention, that since attending APORDE, I managed.
Please wrap up now. We will need to move to please, your last suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I've also managed to recruit my fellow colleagues. Ever since I attended APORDE in 2014, I've managed to encourage colleagues to also enroll in APORDE. So now, as we speak, there are about 5 of us that are fellow APORDians, but most of us, we are not at an executive management level. So that's all that I have to say. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kabanga. Much appreciated, and thank you for the recommendations. As far as I know, the IPPM, which is the industrial policy for policymakers, had a direct targeting to the profile of the people you mentioned, such in the department. But the point is taken, and thank you. We will follow up on it. Last but not least, Nikki, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Christian. For those of you who only attended APORDE after 2020, Christian was the project manager for many years of APORDE when the IDC was involved in the logistics, and that's why he is so familiar with everybody and all the lecturers and so on. All right. In terms of the closing remarks for the conference as a whole, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for their inputs throughout the morning. Thanks very much to our keynote speakers, Zukiswa and Amir, and to the speakers in this final session, which was wonderful, for their insights under the theme, Where Are We Now? And the impact that APORDE has had on them. For those of you who don't know me, you should, but I am co-course director of APORDE along with Saul, and I lecture in economics at Rhodes University. So it's been wonderful to see the APORDE community's enthusiastic participation in our second annual alumni conference. We'd also like to thank Rizal and the TIPS team for their organization and management of the conference today. And thanks very much to all the session moderators who did a great job. I think that rather than trying to sum up such a diverse range of presentations, I will perhaps touch on an aspect that wasn't covered as much today, but links very much to industrial development on the continent, which is the topic of regional integration and industrial development in my closing remarks. It's also the theme of the upcoming TIPS conference, so perhaps, Saul, you can slip me something for doing promotion for your coming conference. Picking up on the final session's theme of where we are now, I'll close with some reflections also on where we want to be in the future, not just where we are now, and perhaps end with a challenge to part of our alumni community. As you know, the APORDE program was initiated with the aim of building capacity in economics and economic policy making, fostering original thinking on mainstream and alternative approaches to development issues, and to offer alternatives to mainstream policy design and implementation strategies. So are these goals and aspirations still relevant nearly 20 years since the inception of the APORDE program? I think that both in terms of promoting and supporting critical thinking and evidence-based policy making, that I would argue, like Saul and Fiona have, that APORDE is now more relevant than ever. In this regard, to look to the future of where we want to be, it's important not to forget the rich scholarship and policy lessons of the past, which were often swept under the carpet during the neoliberal era. In a 2014 paper entitled The Spread of Economic Doctrines and Policy Making in Post-Colonial Africa, Thandika Mkandawire, who was former director of CODIS RIA and an inspiration to more than a generation of African scholars, and also a previous APORDE lecturer, examines the relationship between economic ideas and policy making on the continent in the past 5 decades. Thandika identifies the shift from what he calls the structuralist, developmentalist perspectives of the 1960s and 70s during the phase of development planning through the neoliberal period of the 1980s and 90s, the structural adjustment phase, to a more eclectic combination of neo-institutionalism and growth orientation in combination with a focus on poverty alleviation issues. The latter he terms what we know as the post-Washington consensus era, but he emphasizes that it is still situated within an essentially neoclassical framing of ideas. While gently chastising economists on the continent for a lack of self-reflection on the state of their discipline, Thandika also explores how domestic competencies were harnessed or oriented to carry out policy in each of the 3 phases mentioned above. Towards the end of what Thandika calls the development planning phase, arguably the most ambitious statement of intent on economic development on the continent, the Lagos Plan of Action, was launched in April 1980 by African heads of state under the auspices of the OAU. The LPA, as I'm sure you're all aware, calls for Africa's integration based on collective self-reliance and endogenous development, with a major role for industrialization. Indeed, in the development planning phase of the 1960s and 1970s, regional integration was seen as an instrument of industrial development on the continent, inspired by the insights of African and Latin American thinkers, and what has since been called a development integration approach. However, within a short space of time, the context in which the LPA emerged had altered markedly as the neoliberal era took hold. In 1981, the World Bank released a study entitled Accelerated Development in Sub-Saharan Africa, an Agenda for Action, the infamous Berg Report, which became, as Thandika remarked in 1985, quote, the main text of the neoliberal doctrine as repackaged for the African continent. In reflecting on this trajectory in a lecture on economic decolonization delivered in the early 1980s, Adebayo Adedeji, who was Executive Secretary of UNECA from 1975 to 1991, and a key architect of the LPA, argued that a great weakness at that time was not simply the perpetuation of colonial economic policies or the lack of coherent constructive strategies and institutional arrangements to accelerate growth and structural change, nor in fact the excessive external dependence of African economies. Adedeji argued that it is fundamentally the lack of visualization, he meant by leaders and captains of industry and so on, as to what they would like to see our countries become individually and as a group, say 20 to 25 years from now. And the bit I really liked in this quote was, it is this image of oneself in the future that is a condition for policy making and strategy design. Now, although the idea of a development integration approach on the continent appears to be taking root more broadly again, there still appears to be a sense of confusion about what regional integration seeks to be in the context of the AFCFTA. A tool for insertion into a global free trade system or an active instrument of industrialization and development. An innovative approach is certainly required for development integration to inform the evolution of the remaining AFCFTA negotiating processes. What I wanted to stress was that there are lessons to be learned from early approaches to regional integration in the 1960s and 70s, with regional policy instruments such as the Central American Integration Bank and Regime for Integration Industries, and the Solidarity Fund of the early West African Customs Union that could all benefit from further research. More is needed, however, in a contemporary setting, as there's a lack of focus in regional integration scholarship and practice on transnational actors, domestic interest groups, and political economy factors stressed by some of the speakers this morning, and how these impact on regional integration initiatives. I hope that some of these issues will be addressed in the upcoming TIPS conference, which has a theme along these lines. What about the challenge to the alumni community? Those in the academic and research environment are well aware of the consistent pressure to publish their research abroad. It is very rewarding, however, to continue to revisit the rich scholarship of authors on the continent, to continue to use your own scholarship to support the rich existing knowledge base on the continent through a focus on publishing in and reviewing for African journals and building your own across the continent. In this spirit, perhaps an APORDE working paper series is something that we should think about. At the same time, we should continue to explore the scholarship and policy lessons of other developing regions, not only those that have typically been looked at in the past, but also perhaps those less explored, such as the MENA region. Indeed, APORDE still has a key role to play. On that note, I'd like to close the conference and hand back to Saul. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nikki, and thanks everyone for a great day. Looking forward to seeing you all soon, and hopefully at the next year's APORDE Alumni Conference. We're circulating the APORDE applications or call for applicants. If you can circulate that to your colleagues, and also please use the LinkedIn site and post your own work and share some of the information on the LinkedIn site to colleagues. Thanks, everyone.